Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister last week told me, he was listening to his colleague from the Minister of Health last week, the minister clearly said they investigated, so obviously that you people are not talking or whatever, or that the people that work in and around hospitals in Waterford, their health and safety isn't important to you. I hope I'm wrong, Mr. Speaker. I hope I'm wrong. Mr. Speaker, but this opens a whole other question, Mr. Speaker, because with this illness happening in there, it causes a couple of things. One, not the least of which, is people that will not want to work in that system and will compromise the general operation and probably drive workers that are there, including emergency service workers, where it's under attack now, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the minister, when are you going to set this as a priority and find out what is making those workers sick?
Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the honourable member. This certainly is a priority, and I understand from my colleague that testing is taking place and inspectors are doing their jobs now to try and remedy the problem.
The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Agriculture announced $2.5 million for Nova Scotia farmers. My question is,
Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The honourable member for Annapolis has the floor.
it's unfortunate for the minister that they all don't get a chance to vote for him. Is this new money or is this money that's being reallocated?
The honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to thank the member opposite for believing in the agricultural community and participating in my task force.
Order, please. The honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, in reference to the question that was asked, the $2.5 million has been in the budget for some time, and we felt that it was better served in farmers' hands than it was in our coffers. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my question is this $2.5 million specifically to be used to address the BSE issue, or is it to be used for other agricultural problems?
The honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
As it was stipulated in my statement yesterday, it is across all commodities to help people get into some new programs, to help them if they're down, and to really help this industry. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Considering this is a far cry from the $7 million that the Federation of Agriculture asked for, I'm asking the minister, is he prepared today to allow the task force to recommend financial spending when we meet and finalize our plan on October 31st?
The honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member well knows, that we're asking for recommendations from the task force, and we will look at those recommendations when they come forward to this House when it comes. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Community Services. This government has done nothing to rectify past government's record of steadily degrading the standard of living for seniors in this province. And it is true that many seniors in long-term care facilities are there because they can no longer feed, clothe, or care for themselves. But others suffer primarily from limited mobility. They need canes, walkers, wheelchairs to cover even the shortest distances, and so climbing stairs is just not an option. But many seniors' housing projects confront them with stairs, and one of them is, as you know, from a previous resolution in my constituency, the Captain William Spry Lodge. The result of this stair challenge is that the people there are forced into long-term care facilities with the well-known devastating financial consequences for themselves and their families. Why has this government failed to install the much-needed and long overdue elevator at the Captain Spry Lodge?
Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member opposite for her question. She gives us a chance to point out that this government is very concerned about seniors, and particularly the question of accessibility. I think as has been mentioned before in this chamber, 85% of our seniors' units are accessible, either ground floor or through elevators. And of course, when time takes its toll, Mr. Speaker, and those that maybe once perhaps could climb the stairs now need the use of an elevator or a ground floor apartment, we encourage them to work with the housing authority, and we will find them a place that is accessible. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Halifax Atlantic on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, some of the 15% of those of senior centres are in my constituency, and some of the residents of this particular Captain William Spry, for some of them, time has taken the final toll, and they have never yet been able to reach their home, or they have been forced into long-term care. My predecessor, the former MLA for Halifax Atlantic, raised the issue last fall when he presented a petition signed by over 700 residents of the area. The petition called on the minister of the time to undertake immediate action to have an elevator installed so as to, in this residence, to ease the burden for senior citizens who have contributed so much to our society. Given this long-term knowledge of this situation, how can one justify the continued non-existence of this badly needed elevator?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, indeed, there are 12,500 units roughly of public housing in this province, many of which are occupied by seniors, and many of which are there on a very affordable rent-to-income basis. We are very proud of what we do for seniors, Mr. Speaker, with regards to public housing, and we look forward to doing more through the Affordable Housing Initiative. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Time allotted for question period has expired. We have two introductions. The Honourable Premier on an introduction.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would draw to the attention of all members in the gallery opposite a well-known Nova Scotian, a member of the Council of Richmond, and as well a former warden of the County of Richmond, Mr. Richie Cotton.
Certainly welcome our guest to the gallery today, the Honourable Member for Dartmouth South, Portland Valley on introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce to the Legislative Assembly in the West Gallery a resident of Dartmouth South, Portland Valley, and a much valued volunteer, Helen Fleet.
Again, we welcome our special guest to the gallery today and hope she joins the proceedings. Opposition members' business, the Honourable House Leader for the Liberal Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, will you please call resolution number 246?
Resolution number 246. The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise and speak on this particular resolution. It goes to the core of what concerns Nova Scotians most at this particular time. The ultimate question that this resolution raises is whether or not Nova Scotians deserve to know whether the tax cut they voted for on August 5th was based on false information. That, I would submit, Mr. Speaker, is clearly a relevant question on October 8th, 2003. At first, when I thought of this, Mr. Speaker, I thought that this is a question of fairness. Was it fair for Nova Scotians not to have the full information about the state of the finances of this province on August 5th? But I realize this is a question, Mr. Speaker, of more than just fairness. This is a question of integrity and credibility as we move forward. This is a question of trust. It's a question of whether or not we are going to be able to resolve the fiscal challenges that this province presently finds itself in. Now, I understand that the government is saying that there are still variables that need to be considered and that we don't have the full, final, dotted information. What seems clear, however, Mr. Speaker, is that there's been a great deal of information that has been known for some period of time. If I were to take you back to the Committee of the Whole House supply debates of April 25th, and at that time the then Minister of Finance was commenting on the challenges that face this province, and specifically he spoke about a problem with respect to a census. Now, despite that, and despite that concern not finding its way into the books, despite a contingent liability not being put in place, despite contingencies not being put in place, and we have this razor-thin surplus that was projected, the government still went forward with election spree promises, whether it was the schools or the bridges, or whether it was the seniors on the day before the election who got that, who seemed to receive a suggestion that they too were going to receive money in the pocket. At the end of the day, it ultimately becomes troubling that Nova Scotians on August 5th didn't know the full picture of the province's finances, particularly when finances were at the core of the issues that were being debated at that time. Advertisement after advertisement was being portrayed in the Nova Scotia newspapers and also on our televisions and radios that spoke about two balanced budgets, spoke about fiscal responsibility. This government will remember that the two promises that it made back in Blue Book 1 was that above all else we will fix the healthcare system, and above all else we will live within our means. There was the expression that was used on page 1 of the old Blue Book that it's wrong to borrow and millions of dollars to mortgage the future of our children without so much as a plan. Well, frankly, Mr. Speaker, that couldn't be more true, and it couldn't be more true today, given the history of this province, because for many of us, we have our children going to schools that are under-resourced. For many of us, we find ourselves with waiting lines that are too long, and we find ourselves in a province that has the highest tuition rates of any province in this country, the highest debt problems of any undergraduate students in this entire country. And when you finally come back to it and you look at the state of our roads, you ask yourself the question, how did we get here? How did we forsake the present? How did we forsake our children? And inescapably, we come to the conclusion that it was because we failed to manage the finances of this province. Now, the New Democrats, to their credit, speak often about the needs of the underdog, the needs of seniors, for example, and they should be applauded for that. But one thing that needs to be recognized by the New Democrats and others is that in order for us to provide the level of support that is needed for seniors, we need to make sure we're living within our means first. If we continue to talk about cutting checks and making promises that are irresponsible, if we're not transparent about the choices that we have to make, if we dupe Nova Scotians into buying a 10% tax cut that isn't affordable, then where does that leave us at the end of the day? It leaves us with repeating the same old problems that got us in this situation in the first place. And that's what we find in this present day. We find ourselves in a situation, Mr. Speaker, where Nova Scotians were told over and over that the books were fine and the books were balanced. Well, we know with certainty that this problem, April 25th was when the former Minister of Finance first started to speak about it. But this problem, as was revealed by the Minister of Finance today, stretches back for a number of years. This $150 million problem that was announced today, potential problem, is one that stretches back for some considerable period of time. How, in the name of good fiscal management, could we not have foreseen that? How, in the name of good fiscal management, in a province that has failed so often to manage the books of this province, could we have missed putting that on the books? Could we have spoken to Nova Scotians about that liability? How could we be at this stage of the fiscal year with just less than 6 months left trying to adjust now? It seems, according to the minister's comments from yesterday, for $72 to $92 million in shortfalls. What does that mean to the services that we provide? We spoke about the needs of farmers. We spoke about the needs of students. We speak about the needs of, as the member from Glace Bay said earlier today, he spoke about lineups in our healthcare system that continue to grow longer. All of this presents enormous questions to Nova Scotians. They recognize that government is ultimately about making choices. And the choices that Nova Scotians were faced with was one of being responsible, living within our means, and making sure that education, health, and our roads are properly taken care of, or to move forward with information that was clearly, at the very least, Mr. Speaker, incomplete. Advertisement after advertisement. And then you have the letter that I sent on July 9th to the Premier. July 9th, 2003, I'd be happy to table this if any members wish. Letter to the Premier outlining 10 points 9 questions referring to the state of the finances of this province, suggesting that clearly we are not in the fiscal order that the Premier and members of his government have suggested for so long. Clearly, Nova Scotians, before they go to the polls, need to know the whole story. Because it was on July 15th that the province of New Brunswick announced, oops, we too have a problem. On July 15th, New Brunswick knew that they had a problem, but it took us more than 2 months later before we were able to speak to the nature of the problem that we have in Nova Scotia. Coincidentally, that happened shortly after an election. Nova Scotians are, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, as the Premier implied in his response to one of my questions earlier today, tired of cynical politics. And it is the height of cynicism, I would suggest, for Nova Scotians not to be told the full story about whether or not they can afford a tax cut when they're given when that is squarely one of the questions that sits before them. Now the tough choices have to be made. The tough choices about whether or not to cut services in our hospitals. The tough choices about whether or not we cut childcare down in the South Shore with respect to students who might be in the high school. Tough choices that will continue to grow about whether we can indeed reduce class sizes, whether indeed we can provide the need to our students with special needs at the level that they properly need it. Those are questions that Nova Scotians need to hear, and overriding all of that, clearly the people who are civil servants of this province want to and need to know whether or not they are going to have a job in 6 months' time. I said at a debate, Mr. Speaker, that the Premier did not show up to that was hosted by the NSGEU back in the spring of this year, that the greatest threat to the civil servants in this province was the tax cut that was irresponsible and premature. That is the nub of the problem about whether or not we're going to be facing significant layoffs. We understand, having worked in government, unlike the NDP, we understand the pressures that come with being in government. We recognize that the choices the Premier and his government have to make are not easy ones, and that the list of demands on government are great. But we recognize an irresponsible decision when it comes forward. Irresponsible because if we note what there's often a comment made by the NDP about whether or not this last election was about providing a better deal for working families. Well, let's consider what this tax cut accomplishes. First of all, the people who did not receive the $155 checks, Mr. Speaker, will not be receiving the tax benefit from this. Well, it's interesting to note also that 16,000 Nova Scotians who did receive the $155 check on the previous occasion, on this occasion, because they earn less than $10,000, will only receive $13 in tax relief in 2004. So they're receiving less than the $155 that they received before. And a huge 84% of the money is going to the Nova Scotians who need it least. Well, that to me doesn't strike the note of trying to provide a better deal for working families in this province, Mr. Speaker. What we need is a fair deal for all Nova Scotians. We had the announcement a day before we came up to the election. And post-election, of course, we had the new position that was taken by this government on September 19th. Yes, we are concerned about the state of the finances of this province. We are concerned about the state of the finances of this province because it goes right to the root of whether or not we're going to get mired in the old problems that we do right now. We do have a choice in these circumstances, Mr. Speaker, through you to the Premier. And the choice that we are presenting is one that we recognize would be politically difficult in the circumstances. It involves canceling this tax cut. It involves, at the very least, addressing the question for at least 1 year that we could delay this tax cut until we determine what the state of the books are at some later date. These are all reasonable and balanced positions. In providing this olive branch of a suspension as opposed to a cancellation, we are trying to make this minority situation work so that we are not finding ourselves in a situation where we are hurting seniors and hurting students and hurting farmers and hurting regular Nova Scotians. It is folly to go forward with the plans that this government has set forward. We've had the new announcements. They started on September 19th with the quarterly report, followed by the September 30th. We I received a letter from the Minister of Finance suggesting that we could follow up perhaps after October 10th with more meetings with the Liberal Party to talk about the state of the finances of the province. At that time, we were looking to seek out a consensus, to find as best we could all of the information that was available, because we want to work with the Department of Finance and the people there to determine whether or not the choices that we have to make are ones that we as a party in a minority situation can ultimately support. We can't afford to delay, however, Mr. Speaker, because we know with certainty that October 15th is the deadline that is given to us in normal circumstances for notice to come from the provincial government of a change in the tax structure in this province. That's 7 days away. There may be some flexibility, I hope. I understand from the comments that the Premier provided in the answer to one of his questions that he would be speaking to the Prime Minister tomorrow. Obviously, fiscal situations are going to be at the top of the agenda. We in this party, we in the Liberals, in the Liberal Party, recognize that governing is not easy. It's ultimately about choices, and it's difficult to go back on decisions that were made and voted on by the people of Nova Scotia. But one thing that we are committed to, and we will remain committed to for as long as we can stand here, is fiscal responsibility so that generations of Nova Scotians don't continue to be sold out by irresponsible fiscal financing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to have an opportunity to join this debate, this motion that was brought forward, and to share a few views on this motion. Mr. Speaker, I think as I read the resolution, the text of the resolution and what the leader of the Liberal Party spoke about were kind of two different things, and I think I want to deal with those in two separate segments. And let me first direct my comments towards the resolution. The resolution indicates that with spending, that the finances are in jeopardy. But Mr. Speaker, I think I'd like to, as I address those, I'd like to talk about the past for a moment. Yes, Mr. Speaker, this government did announce that we were going to build new schools. Those schools have been allowed to deteriorate, and we had many requests from all across the province to replace those schools. And our government takes the risk of the health of children, teachers, and staff in those schools very seriously, and we knew that they had to be replaced. Yes, Mr. Speaker, it's true that we did put millions of dollars into health care. We have provided a 7% increase to the DHAs. And just in their last quarterly update, we provided additional money for the DHAs to be able to provide the service that people expect. That money was directed towards dialysis, fighting of cancer research drugs, and the therapies, and finding new doctors and nurses to look after Nova Scotians in medical help. Yes, Mr. Speaker, this government did put new money into pavement. Right now, we are watching new stretches of highway open on the 101. Just last week, Transportation and Public Works Minister Mr. Russell announced the 11 kilometers of new twin concrete pavements were open to drivers. The minister indicated that the end is in sight of this phasing of twinning of Highway 101, make available a first-class section of road. Mr. Speaker, with better safety and improved travel for motorists and their families, that is something that this government did invest in. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't presume that this motion suggests that we not spend any money and let the people who want new schools, highways, and health care and better roads, that we just not provide money for that. Mr. Speaker, and the Premier mentioned today, it's true. This government has presented two balanced budgets to the House. In 2002, 2003, we achieved the first balanced budget in 4 decades. It wasn't easy, Mr. Speaker. There were many challenges, and those challenges that we had to meet. But, Mr. Speaker, that was what this government was committed to, and we met that challenge. We have managed responsibly, providing the level of care that Nova Scotians deserve. We have reduced our debt to GDP ratio, Mr. Speaker, and we have reduced our foreign debt exchange exposure, and we have hit that target ahead of time. Mr. Speaker, as I announced in the financial update, we've reduced our debt servicing costs. The dollar, of course, is a major factor in that. And we've introduced our 4-year debt reduction plan. Mr. Speaker, we believe by introducing the tax relief and providing tax reliefs to taxpayers, we are providing assistance to those Nova Scotians, and we are making our economy competitive. But, Mr. Speaker, when we balance the 2002-2003 budget, we know that each and every year would be a challenge. Some of those challenges are predictable. We knew that there was increased demands for health care. We knew there was a need for new infrastructure and need to replace the aging infrastructure. Now we have new, less predictable challenges coming to us, Mr. Speaker. We presented a balanced budget in the House for the 2003-04 fiscal year, and it is our intention to end that year with that balance. But first, we must look after the needs of Nova Scotians in difficulties. Over the past 10 days, we have been responding to the emergencies created by Hurricane Juan. Mr. Speaker, our EMO Center has been hailed up as a model for operations for other jurisdictions to follow. We proved that cooperation is the only way to respond to emergencies. A great many Nova Scotians continue to need help in the wake of the hurricane, and just as the provinces have been doing before the emergency recovery, we will be there during the financial and economic recovery as well. We anticipate the federal government will be a full partner in that effort, as they have been before, and we would expect them to be there again. But, Mr. Speaker, as been said in the House here by a lot of people, Nova Scotians need help, and they need it now. The province has initiated a range of activities at every level, with the federal government to remove roadblocks and get dollars flowing to farmers, fishermen, and others in dire financial need. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the frontline workers who provided response to this emergency. I want to thank all of those who put in hard days and nights, working sometimes around the clock to restore power to homes through the last 10 days. And we want to thank all of those directly affected, whether living in Bedford or in Tatamagouche, for your patience in this time. But, Mr. Speaker, in response to this resolution, we are not going to allow anything to be put in jeopardy is the immediate needs of Nova Scotians. In our priorities, and in the meantime, Mr. Speaker, officials throughout government are examining options to reduce spending so that we can reach the savings that we need to reach of $32 million. Yet again, this is another challenge. Mr. Speaker, at the quarterly update, when we looked at that, we had based that on figures that had been for the first half of the year. And those figures from January to June were released, the statistics were released, and when we got those in the early part of September and we reviewed those over, we felt it was prudent to react to the declining revenues that we saw coming. And that's why we forecast the declining revenues, and Mr. Speaker, that's why we put in a plan to start to mitigate that. At the end of this year, perhaps the revenue stream will have changed, but we saw that there was something coming along that was showing our forecast that was going to be less than we had already projected, so we put in a process to take those out. Mr. Speaker, that was just one of the challenges. Mr. Speaker, sometimes it's a challenge dealing with the federal government. I'll be sitting down with my provincial and territorial counterparts this week, and we'll be sitting down with the Minister of Finance, and on Friday there will be several topics on the agenda. One topic is clearly the renewal of the equalization process. That process has been going on for some time, but there is a deadline looming, Mr. Speaker, and that deadline is for April 1st of next year. We have to have legislation in place. And so that's why the finance people are meeting this week with the federal minister. We have to move that process along. The second part of the process, Mr. Speaker, will be to talk about the federal government's commitment on CHT to health care and the money they announced last year. Now, we knew at the time when they announced that money that there was conditions, that the condition were that they were in a financial position to do so. And that's why, as a government, we didn't book those dollars, because we weren't certain that they would be able to meet that commitment. But they had said they wanted to move forward with the new stream of cash for both health care and for the other social services. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the other main item we'll be talking about with them will be the census change and the need for the relief in terms of that census. Mr. Speaker, this is not something new. This is when the ministers have met before, and in the history of this process, what the government has done is they've found ways to mitigate this relief, and they've changed the census. And Mr. Speaker, not only that, but just last fall, when they had the stock transfer issue with 4 provinces, and there was some overpayments on that, which went way back prior to the open years that the federal government had opened. They forgave the first year. So, Mr. Speaker, we're not talking about breaking new ground here. We're not talking about something new. They've done this before. But, Mr. Speaker, we will be pushing the federal government to make the changes to the equalization formula. We want to ensure the equalization program is adequately funded so that the original purpose and intent of the program to provide basic and comparable level of service to all Canadians is not forgotten. Mr. Speaker, we will be looking for some enhancements to the equalization. I want to hear from Mr. Manley that the federal commitment to additional health care funding is there. And Mr. Speaker, we want to know that the equalization receiving process will be getting that census relief I referred to earlier. But as we know, Mr. Speaker, the federal government has had accumulated surpluses, and they have ranged in the tens of billions of dollars over the past several years. So expecting the provinces to come up with this money, to pay back, seems rather silly at this time, and it just seems simply not fair. But these are some of the factors, Mr. Speaker, that impact not only on this year's budget, but future budgets as well. There may be further potential negative impacts on the equalization program, but there could be positive offsets as well. We are at a critical stage of this right now. And, Mr. Speaker, when the data is updated weekly, the true picture won't be clear for weeks or even months to come. And that's clearly one of the situations that the finance people will be asking the federal minister to do, is to bring that information and get it available on a more timely basis and have it so we can do more accurate projections and have a better idea of where we're going to be. So, Mr. Speaker, the federal provincial ministers, we want to meet with the federal minister, we want him to act, and we want him to recognize their obligations to all Canadians. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that all parties in this House are anxious for the federal government and the provinces to be able to work out an equalization plan that's fair for not only Nova Scotians, but for all Canadians. And, Mr. Speaker, as we move forward, that's what our goal will be. Mr. Speaker, on a brighter note, on contrary to the resolution on 246, I think members should realize and recognize that the U.S. economy is starting to strengthen. But there are many factors that come into our budget. The U.S. economy, as I indicated to the briefing of the opposition leader and the Liberal leader, that was one of the factors that we had to change, because the GDP factor wasn't increasing for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons was the fact that Nova Scotians weren't spending as much as anticipated. One of the reasons was the U.S. economy wasn't coming back as quickly as possible, and one of the reasons, a variety of reasons that we had talked about. So that was the reason, Mr. Speaker, that we had to change our forecast. We had to look at those things and say, all right, now we're projecting for 6 months out from now. If we're starting to see trends that our revenues aren't going to be as strong, we have to react to it. And, Mr. Speaker, that's what we did as we move forward. Now, I think there's 2 issues that I'd like to clear up with the leader of the Liberal Party. There's 2 issues here, Mr. Speaker. The issue of the equalization structure is not only this year, but the equalization process goes back a number of years. It goes back the open years of the books the federal government has opened. And indeed, what we're speaking about here is changes, and when the provinces are talking about, it's not simply fiscal year that we're in now, we're talking about adjustments to year 0001, 0102, 0203. Because those are the years that the census data was given to us, the years the census data which was projected by Stats Canada, those were the 4 years that those data have been paid out on. So obviously when they change those statistics and they come up with new population census figures, those whole 4 years have to be adjusted. So Mr. Speaker, as we will have to in this province, as those numbers come through, those previous years, we will have to book in our last year. That will be the date we will have the numbers, and we will have to book those adjustments that we have in our fiscal year, which will close in the very near future, but it will be for the fiscal year ending 03. Obviously, the impacts for this year. So that when we talk to the federal government, about what they've done before under this condition, they have always dealt with the years that they have open. Now, I understand that their years open and our years open aren't the same, and I understand that they only go back with their open years a couple years. But, Mr. Speaker, that's what we will be speaking to them about, and that's what we hope to have from the federal government.
Member's time has expired. I'd like to recognize the honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to rise as the opposition finance critic on this motion, resolution number 246, which I'd like to actually read to maybe provide some grounding to the debate, since the Liberal leader apparently didn't feel the need to be burdened by the actual wording of the resolution under debate. Mr. Speaker, it reads as follows: Therefore be it resolved that the members of this House urge the government to tell the people when it knew it might not achieve a balanced budget and reveal the full extent of the possible new deficit, including less than expected equalization payments and the impact of Hurricane Juan. So that's the resolution on the floor. Now, there's a certain amount of the resolution that it's easy to agree with. First of all, I think the government needs to be much more forthcoming than it has been over the past number of years with the true state of the province's finances. I still, and my party still, does not agree or admit that this province has ever had a balanced budget, because the first so-called balanced budget was proposed to this legislature for the 2002-03 fiscal year, and we have still not received the final audited public accounts for that year. And it appears that the public accounts may not be delivered in the month of October as they usually are, because the Department of Finance is arguing with the Auditor General over the final numbers. And although the Auditor General didn't say it today, reading between the lines, I can only assume that the reason the Department of Finance is arguing is because the final audited public accounts are not going to show a balanced budget. Why else would the department argue with the Auditor General, be continuing to argue this late in the year? There has not been independent third-party arm's-length verification at any time that last year's budget was in fact balanced.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, and that brings us to the current fiscal year, the 03-04 fiscal year, when all that has happened this spring was that a surplus, a very small surplus, was projected by this government based on dozens of assumptions, which of course are now in play. We don't know for sure how those assumptions are going to match with the real world. That's just the way things work. The budget is a projection, saying all other things being equal, and if our assumptions prove to be true, this is how the year is going to play out. But of course, the government projected a tiny surplus, a fraction of 1% of the overall provincial budget, and any of a number of things could knock the budget projections out of whack. Now, the least of those would be a natural disaster, such as we have all suffered in this province in the last couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker, because we still don't know today what is the cost of the damage caused by the hurricane, nor do we know how much of that cost is going to have to be picked up by the province, nor do we know how much the federal government is going to share, nor do we know what the ultimate impact on the provincial budget is going to be. That is one of dozens of things that are in play right now. there is still too much game playing with the provincial budget. And yes, the government follows generally accepted accounting principles. And if I may say, the first and last compliment I'm going to pay to the Liberal caucus in my remarks today is that the move towards generally accepted accounting principles was started by the Liberals when they were in government. It was started by them, and they moved rather slowly on it. And it was a process completed by the current government, or I suppose technically speaking the last government, the government that existed before the last election. But just the fact that we are now at a state of generally accepted accounting principles doesn't mean that there's not a lot of hocus pocus going on, because there is.
Look at the pensions.
Mr. Speaker, there are still, especially in the current year, I'm not talking about any audited year for which the books have closed, because that's all above board. But for the current fiscal year, there are so many ways for the government to hide, deliberately or otherwise, what's really going on. And my colleague here, the member for Richmond, mentioned as an example the pension adjustments, pension valuations. Big issue, which hasn't really come to a conclusion yet. The result of that one is still to be seen. And that's only one example. There are a number of choices the government makes about how and when it's going to change its financial assumptions. There are many, many ways for the government to not tell the public everything that it knows about the state of the province's finances. Now, having said that, and to that extent, the resolution is correct as far as it goes. I have to say that the Liberal view of the provincial budgetary process is unbelievably simplistic, Mr. Speaker. Unbelievably simplistic. Mr. Speaker, there are dozens of factors at play, billions of dollars at stake. There are many things going on in the world that have a positive or negative effect on the provincial economy, and every time something happens, the Liberal leader jumps up and says, "Aha! I told you," when any reasonable person where they're handling their own personal budget, their family budget, their business budget, or the provincial budget, knows that absolutely the last thing to do, the worst thing to do, is to have a knee-jerk reaction to every small blip in the economy or in other events. But every single day, the Liberal leader stands up with something new and says, look, they've got to change their projections, they've got to change the budget, we need more briefings, we need this, we need that. And Mr. Speaker, if that's how that leader would manage the finances of the province, waving with the wind at every event that happens instead of steering a long-term course, then, Mr. Speaker, I, for one, am glad that that leader's party came third in the last election. Mr. Speaker, the resolution today says that the government should announce when it knew it might not achieve a balanced budget. Well, the government knew this from day one. The government knew from day one they might not achieve a balanced budget because they announced a surplus that was so small that from an accounting point of view, it's insignificant. And they knew that the smallest change in world events could change the balance of the budget. So, of course, the government knew and has known from the day they presented the budget. They want the government to say when they knew what the possible new deficit was, as if the government and the officials of the Department of Finance aren't monitoring that thing every single day, whether there's a disaster or not. Mr. Speaker, if the Liberal leader doesn't know already, there are major risk factors at play in any budget, in any year, at any time, like equalization payments, like prior year adjustments, which amount to tens of millions of dollars. They dwarf any program cuts the government could make, and yet they amount to tens of millions of dollars using a formula and a negotiation process that's a mystery to all but the initiated in the Department of Finance. Currency swings. We're in the midst of a currency swing. The Canadian dollar going up. Canadian dollar goes up, goes down. It has a multi-million-dollar impact day by day on the provincial budget. Interest rates, same impact. The pension valuation, same. Wage settlements, the same thing. And those are some of the major risk factors worth tens of millions of dollars. So now we come to Hurricane Juan, and I think the thing that is most unseemly about the Liberal leader's approach to this whole issue is both the resolutions that the Liberal Party has called for debate today draw a link between the Liberal election platform and Hurricane Juan. You know, if there was anything more cynical, more partisan, more inappropriate at a time of a natural disaster, it's hard to think of what it is, than this crowd over here trying to fight the last election in the wake of a natural disaster and saying to the government, we just had a hurricane, it proves we were right all along what we were saying in the election. Mr. Speaker, they should be embarrassed. They should be embarrassed. Instead, the Liberal leader stands up and preaches to all of us about fiscal integrity. If I have time, Mr. Speaker, I may have a few thoughts in a few minutes about the Liberal approach to fiscal integrity when they actually had their hands on the controls. But let me say what Hurricane Juan was in my constituency. It wasn't an occasion for partisan rejoicing. It was a human disaster. People were killed, Mr. Speaker. Businesses were badly disrupted, very badly disrupted, not to mention the impact of people in their homes, seniors who could not get down the stairs of high-rise apartment buildings, people who had stored food away in their freezers for the winter, who lost it all and have no money to replace it, people who had uninsured losses to their vehicles when trees or heavy branches fell down and crushed their vehicles. Mr. Speaker, people who went without power. In my constituency, there still is, as far as I know, one street without power, and we are now how many days after Hurricane Juan? Those people are having a very difficult time. Their street was by far the worst damage in my constituency. That is what Hurricane Juan was about. And that's what the government is dealing with and needs to deal with. And that's what we in the opposition need to be holding their feet to the fire about making sure that the response is appropriate, and where it's not appropriate, to make sure that appropriate changes are made for the next time. When it comes to Hurricane Juan, that's what the people in this House should be talking about. But instead, the Liberals bring forward a partisan resolution linking the hurricane with the correctness of their election platform, Mr. Speaker. And if they're not embarrassed about drawing that direct link, well, I'm embarrassed for them. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal leader gave the same speech he gave during the election. He's trying to refight the last election, and someday the Liberal leader will accept that his party came third. I was shocked, Mr. Speaker, in question period today, and doubly shocked when the Liberal leader repeated it in his remarks today, that in his opinion, the election result can be explained by the fact that the voters of Nova Scotia were duped. That's the word he used, duped. He used it in question period, and he used it again in his remarks today. The Liberal Party, which sees itself as the natural governing party of Nova Scotia, still cannot understand or believe or accept that they came third. They are the third choice of Nova Scotia voters, and that with voters knowing what the party platforms were, what the party stood for, and what they were going to get depending on how they voted. The voters of Nova Scotia were not duped, Mr. Speaker. The voters of Nova Scotia were not duped, and again I would say the Liberal leader should be embarrassed about putting forward that point of view in this legislature, that the people who put each of us here were duped, Mr. Speaker, because they didn't vote for his party. And I wonder if maybe the Liberal leader might think about that line of thinking and perhaps retract it at some point. Mr. Speaker, there is one word that comes to my mind when I hear any member of this legislature talking about the voters being duped and having been fooled into the voted the way they were. But since I can't use that word in this legislature, I'll just use the word hubris. That leader comes into this House. That leader comes into this House having just celebrated his second month in office, and he lectures us about his experience, Mr. Speaker. That's his second month of holding public office, Mr. Speaker, and he's lecturing us about his experience. So let me turn then to his party's experience. Do I have 1 minute left, Mr. Speaker, or more?
A little more.
My time is running out. So let me say this, Mr. Speaker, that if that Liberal leader feels that he wants to change the way that politics is done in Nova Scotia, that very possibly the first place he should look at changing it the way his party does things, Mr. Speaker, because that Liberal leader stands up here and preaches to this House about how things should be done when his party were thrown out on their ears in 1999 because the people of Nova Scotia were sick and tired of the way the Liberal Party ran the government. That is the same party that tried to argue there was a balanced budget even though the government was borrowing $600 million, and Merlin, the minister, tried to wave his magic wand and pretend that it was really balanced. That's his party's track record, Mr. Speaker, and then he dares, this gentleman with 2 months' experience, dares to come in and preach to this House about fiscal integrity and doing the right thing with the province's books. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to continuing this line of discussion in the next resolution. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. I recognize the honourable member for Richmond.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you see all sorts of things in this House, and I've been here 5 years. I should point out longer than the member from Halifax Fairview, who's got all this wonderful experience now all of a sudden to himself be able to preach to us. But I got to tell you, Mr. Speaker, who would have thought we would see the member from Halifax Fairview be the chief apologist for the Conservative Party of this province? Who would have thought we would see that day? But, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give notice, especially this week because the offshore energy conference is taking place in Halifax, that the Minister of Energy should be talking with the member from Halifax Fairview. Because if the member from Halifax Fairview buries his head any deeper in the sand, one can only hope he hits natural gas. But with our luck, he'll only find granite at the end of the day. Mr. Speaker, let me speak in simple terms for the member from Halifax Fairview. I'm going to try and make it as simple for him as possible. The budget, as he has said, is based on assumptions. But the budget in itself, if it is based on false assumptions, misleading assumptions, then obviously there's questions to be asked of that budgetary process. When the budget was first introduced, the Liberal Party immediately questioned the assumptions made on federal equalization payments. The record shows that. The member from Halifax Fairview can go and look into that. At that point, because we were told their assumptions are false, they will not receive the equalization payments they are projecting. Our leader, throughout the campaign, continued to ask the Premier, can you assure us that your assumptions are correct, as you claimed? The Premier refused to answer. Why did he refuse to answer? Because the Liberal Party and most Nova Scotians who were watching knew that the assumptions were false. Yet, ironically, who's the other party that was following these false assumptions? The New Democratic Party, the Socialist Party, who are saying, yes, the Tories are doing a wonderful job, yet they can't understand why they only picked up 3 seats in the last election. We picked up 5 seats. So, I can point that out to the member. But let me make it, Mr. Speaker, for the member from Halifax Fairview to suggest that our leader or our party is trying to link the financial troubles of this province with the hurricane, that is the most simplistic, backward, ignorant argument that I have heard in this House, Mr. Speaker, on that member. Mr. Speaker, let me make it easy for the member. On August the 5th, our province was off target by $32 million. Hurricane Juan is not even in sight. So we're off $32 million. Then, when we start asking the finance minister, what about the equalization payments? He then tells us, well, we could be off $40 to $60 million. Hurricane Juan still hasn't hit shore. So at that point, our province is in the red, potentially, by over $90 million. Still no hurricane. That's the reality. That's why we've questioned this Premier as to when was he aware that these problems existed? What was he doing to prepare, knowing there were problems? And when the Premier's face showed up in my local paper and around this province smiling and saying, balanced budgets, Did he know, while those ads were running, under his approval, that they were false? Mr. Speaker, I would submit to you the fact the Premier refused to answer our leader's question on when did he know on 7 occasions leads us to conclude that the Premier did know. That is why our leader has questioned whether Nova Scotians went to the polls on false assumptions. That's not questioning the outcome, Mr. Speaker. That's not saying they should have voted us rather than vote for them. It is questioning the credibility of the Premier. It's questioning whether they were honest and forthright with Nova Scotians, or whether they intentionally, or I shouldn't say intentionally, because you're not supposed to infer intent, but whether they withheld information that would have been very valuable to Nova Scotians in determining whether they want to re-elect this government. I would submit to you, Mr. Speaker, that if Nova Scotians had been told prior to August 5th, and they had known that this province was off target by $30 million, there would not be 25 Conservative members sitting here in this House. Yet that information somehow was withheld. And to question the Premier on that is a legitimate question. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, we have said in this House since the election that we wanted to work together to try to make minority government work. But based on the answers that we received from the Premier today, being asked simply if he would keep his word, only to see him hurl insults across the floor, and to argue our leader was cynical for asking him if he was going to keep his commitment, I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, not that I have my crystal ball, but if I had one, I would say the long-term future of this government, after what we've seen today, is not going to be very long. It is very dim, Mr. Speaker. The Premier of this province doesn't seem to have caught on that he has a minority government. He doesn't seem to have caught on that he only has 25 members, whereas he needs 27 for a majority. He doesn't seem to have caught on that he can't put things through as he wants, as he did in the past. There'll be no more Bill 68s. There'll be no more paramedic strikes in this province. There'll be no more legislation that the opposition will not approve being passed in this House. And I think the Mayor from Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley should maybe sit down with his good friend, the Premier, and explain that to him and use as simple terms as possible if he has to. Maybe bring some milk with him and some cookies and explain to him, you need the support of one of the opposition parties or we're going back to the polls. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, my suggestion to my own colleagues would be to tell their campaign teams to shine up their signs for the spring. Because if this government's attitude keeps up the way it is, I fear they will not get a budget through this House. Unless, I could be wrong, but maybe the Mayor from Halifax Fairview, with his newfound conversion and love of Tory financial policy, maybe the NDP will prop up this government. Because they suddenly believe that the Tories are doing a great job fiscally. That's what we heard from the Mayor from Halifax Fairview. Well, Mr. Speaker, all along is the Liberal caucus that said, we have some concerns here. We're not willing to accept at face value when the Minister of Finance says all is well. But apparently the NDP were prepared and still are prepared to accept that. So today, before Hurricane Juan hits shore, we know that we're off by almost $90 million. Hurricane's got nothing to do with that. And the Member from Halifax Fairview knew that. For him to try to link those two together was irresponsible. And I don't think any fair-minded Nova Scotian watching would be fooled by that kind of an argument that was made there. But now the reality is today we have Hurricane Juan. And we have the additional pressures that is going to put on. So is it irresponsible to ask the Premier, you're $90 million before the hurricane. Now you've got the hurricane. You've just told the media the hurricane might cost us $100 million. Is it not an appropriate time to question whether that 10% tax cut should go forward? The Liberal caucus has said tax cuts are a good thing. They're a great thing. But you have to do it at a time when you can afford to do so. For our leader to ask today to the Premier, are you willing to reconsider the tax cut in light of the circumstance today, only to watch the Premier hurl insults across the floor? Well, Mr. Speaker, I got to tell you, the good country doctor, the veil is being lifted by the day. To see him hurl insults across it, being asked, when did you know? To being asked, will you keep your word? To being asked, will you reconsider a decision? But that's not the Tory way, Mr. Speaker, and that's not the Premier's way. Because once the Premier said something, regardless of what impact it might have on the bottom line or on Nova Scotians, it's going to go through. But on August the 5th, That's why I think the mayor from Colchester Muscataway Valley should sit with the Premier, explain to him, boss, something changed and something went wrong. We don't have a majority anymore. It can't be your way. You're going to have to cooperate, and you're going to have to listen. And you're not going to be able to put through a budget that's going to add to the debt of this province and walk away and say, I did it again. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to tell you, what was most appalling, if I am to use the word, was what the spectacle that took place at Public Accounts today. To see the new Democratic Party, who are chairing, the mayor from Halifax Fairview chairing Public Accounts, a committee established to review the expenditures of the finances of the province of Nova Scotia, refused to call as their first witness the Deputy Minister of Finance in light of a deficit potentially of $90 million is incredible. What have they put forward as their first witness? They want to bring in the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation Board because the CEO left and they gave him $90,000 as a severance. So is it $90,000 or $90 million that Nova Scotians are interested in? That's the priorities of the NDP party. At the end of the day, it's neither. They have the Department of Health coming in. Is that an important department? Without a doubt. Very important. Many important questions to be asked. But we've already said there's only 7 days left to rescind that tax cut. 7 days. Would it not have been more opportune to bring the Department of Finance in, bring in the Deputy Minister of Finance and say, there's no way out. You're here for 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, and you're going to answer our questions before you go. You're going to tell us when the Premier knew. You're going to tell us at what point the Department of Finance knew. And you're going to tell us whether the assumptions in the budget were accurate. Or was there some playing with those figures? What I would like to see, Mr. Speaker, you also having been part of the class of 1998, you, I believe, having, I'm not sure if you sat on Public Accounts at the time, but your colleague certainly sat. I'd love to see the former Minister of Finance come into Public Accounts and explain to us why his budget is now off by $90 million. Because I remember Public Accounts has certainly brought in former ministers. It's brought in former premiers. So there's precedent there. Yet, what was the meeting concentrated on today? Was it concentrated on asking questions in the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia, of the finances of this province? No. The question from the NDP and the Tories was, can our leaders sit on Public Accounts? That is what your duly elected representatives from the Tories and NDP were discussing while we have a $90 million potential shortfall in this province. That is the reality, Mr. Speaker. And I believe, Mr. Speaker, you are going to see more of the same. And I'm often reminded, Mr. Speaker, when I think of the former member from Cape Breton Nova, and I say former, but I think in our hearts he'll always be the member from Cape Breton Nova. If he were here, he would remind us of his long-standing argument of the NDP-Tory alliance that exists in this province. And after these types of actions today, we're left to ask again whether there is such an alliance. Because when you see a committee of public accounts, which is now, Mr. Speaker, in minority, it is now dominated by the opposition. Now, Mr. Speaker, when committees are dominated by the opposition, you would think this is a great opportunity to keep the government's feet to the fire, to bring in the Deputy Minister of Finance, to bring in whatever other officials from Finance, and to be able to tell Nova Scotians, here's the real deal. You're not only going to sit there and have the Premier tell us all is well, everything's fine. The Minister of Finance now, when he answered a question today, he was criticizing our finance critic because she was using his figures in her argument. And he said, well, she shouldn't use my figures. I just said that, you know. Don't be throwing questions at me based on what I said. That's the reality. But bring them in front of public accounts for 2 hours. See, question period, you've got maybe 3-5 minutes. Minister can dance around, avoid a question. When they're sitting there for 2 to 3 hours in public accounts, that's a different story. They can't get away with the little smart answer or the little snide remark because it'll be followed up by another question and another and another and another for 2 hours. But was that opportunity taken today in public accounts? Did the NDP say, yes, we agree? In the Liberal Party, you know, we agree. There's a $90 million potential shortfall even before the hurricane. Forget about the hurricane for a minute, even before. And yet the chair and the NDP have said that they were not interested in bringing forward the Deputy Minister of Finance as the first witness. The one individual who could answer questions about how much are we off, whether the assumptions in the budget were accurate assumptions. Or was there something else at play?
You know that's not what happened.
You know, Mr. Speaker?
You know that's not
So that is what we had this morning. That is why Nova Scotians will once again have to wait. They will have to wait because the NDP worked with the Tories to avoid having the Department of Finance in, and instead spent the valuable time of that committee arguing that our leader, who is the one person who has led the charge in asking for fiscal accountability and making sure Nova Scotians are aware of what the status is, of the finances, they wanted him removed from the committee. Why? Why? Because maybe he'll get an extra media clip from the member from Halifax Fairview. I would assume that's probably one of the main arguments right there. Maybe our leader might get on the camera, he might make it on the news before he will. That's probably why they want him removed. Mr. Speaker, were the people of Nova Scotia well served this morning at public accounts? I would submit to you they were not. I would submit to you it was shameful what took place this morning in light of the fiscal situation we are in light of the fact that we have a government, we have a party that keeps saying a better deal for Nova Scotia families. Yet $90 million is going to have to be cut out of services of this province. And who's that going to hurt? It's going to hurt the same families they speak of, yet they somehow can't get their heads out of the sand to figure that out. And they stand there and say, we agree.
Honourable member's time has expired. The member from Sackville Beaver Bank, you have about 50 seconds left.
No, the first speaker sat down early. They all went.
The time was adjusted. No speaker can speak more than 15 minutes.
Speak about the first whereas of the resolution. Whereas prior to the election, millions of dollars in spending was announced by the government. The leader of the Liberal Party was very critical during his speech about that type of spending, but I want to remind members of the House that on April 23rd in the House, I asked the Liberal Party and the leader, is Danny Graham going to cut the Cobequid Multi-Service Centre? Is he going to cut the new school for Kingswood? I submit to you, Mr. Speaker, he didn't answer that.
Time has expired, and Resolution 246. I'll recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park. All right, recognize the government House leader.
Not me.
We'll get it right. We'll get it right.
Sorry.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call resolution number 173?
173. I'll recognize the honourable member from Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. I think just to start the debate, it would be good to read the operative clause, since it was pointed out that might have been missed in the last resolution. So I'll learn very quickly, no doubt. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House remember that when this government attempts to use Hurricane Juan as the reason for our financial troubles, we will all know the truth, that it is due to the ill-advised tax rebate. So I think that says it very clearly. What we're saying here is not in any way that we're trying to minimize or belittle the damage and the difficulty that's come from Hurricane Juan. Certainly all of us have been stunned and horrified by the things that we've seen and the damage that has taken place, the way people's lives have been changed, and some people have lost their lives. What we're saying here is that the government cannot explain their financial difficulties on this latest financial stress that they will suffer. The people of Nova Scotia will be looking for some help, and the funds need to be available to provide that assistance. We're just saying this is only the latest in a series of difficulties. So I would like to outline some of those things. We also felt it is ironic, as the resolution says, that checks continue to be sent out based on the $155 rebate from last year's taxes, and some of those were sent out, something like 10,000 of them, the very week of Hurricane Juan. The total of the amount of money that's been sent out just on that $155 rebate has now crept over $72 million. And that is a substantial amount of money, given some of the other financial realities we're now learning about, Mr. Speaker. I think it's also important to note that the people of Nova Scotia continue to talk about these checks, even though some time has passed and many of us received them in June. The reason they're talking is because it still remains very surprising and almost scandalous that they were sent out at that time, and people are also questioning whether or not we can afford it. At the time, they were quite perhaps more confident that we could afford it. Now there are a lot of questions that are arising in their minds. And again, because we've suffered a more recent disaster, that will increase those questions. Have we actually given up a lot of services and help that we need now as a result of that earlier ill-advised tax rebate? The government originally submitted for this year a budget with a very tiny surplus. I think one of the other speakers mentioned that this was almost certain to be very difficult to maintain. It didn't allow for any unforeseen difficulties that we're now running into. No changes in the economic forecast could really be, no negative changes anyway, could be absorbed by that. And we also didn't take account of pressing needs that would arise. Mr. Speaker, I feel the government did not properly allow themselves the room in which to respond to all kinds of eventualities, including emergencies. So did they, or was there any indication that this $32 million would be coming up in as early as the first quarter? Okay, even as these checks were sent out, the minister had presented their best guess or best projections for the year. That was on September 19th. The first quarter results show the budget is at least $32 million short. Within that, the reasons that are given are very clear, and they're on the website right now from the Department of Finance as well. They say a slowdown in consumer spending affecting revenue, lower than expected revenues from HST, and of course the District Health Authority's budgets came in, and that was $19.2 million more than was anticipated. So altogether we're looking at a $32 million shortfall without going into any other issues. Why is this important to Nova Scotians? Why should they care? They have to care because we have the highest debt per capita in the country. We spend more on debt than on education. What does debt really mean? It means that we're not going to have services that we badly need. So we have to be considerate of that. It means that if we have a shortfall in revenue, even the amounts that we've budgeted for this year are not going to be achieved. We're not going to be able to pave roads or look after overcrowded classrooms, build new schools, provide for lower waiting lists and a faster emergency service. There's all kinds of things that individual Nova Scotians will have to give up or will feel the pain from if we don't respond to a shortfall of that magnitude. Now, in the budget that's been updated in September 19th, or presented to us September 19th, that would be the best estimate for the coming year, there was no touch whatsoever or no change made to personal or corporate income taxes, even though the gross domestic product is now estimated to be lower. If the GDP figure is a measure of the economic activity of the province, then if it declines, so too can we expect our incomes and the profitability of our companies to be affected. So let's be very clear. The members of this House and Nova Scotians in general need to remember that the storm, Hurricane Juan, is not the reason for any of our financial problems. It's other indicators that were already listed in the government's website for the first quarter and other things that we've heard about in more recent weeks and perhaps suspected even earlier. We've talked about the transfer payments from Ottawa, and I won't go into that again because I think people are very clear on that, and I think the Minister of Finance has been clear that he's not prepared to provide any substantial figures until he returns from Ottawa or some other event occurs. That's right. So unfortunately, we're being left to wait on that. The official website says official data revisions from the federal government will not be available until later this fall, so it gives a blanket excuse to get out of all of that. In June 2003, the Bank of Montreal came out with their regional outlook, it's called. So it's their economic outlook for the country. And in that, they cited the following reasons for downgrading the estimate for growth in Nova Scotia. They cited the need, Encana's decision to delay its proposed $1 billion Deep Panuke natural gas project that was supposed to bring benefits in 2003. It mentions that the rate of the natural gas production has slowed noticeably so far this year. It talks about difficult export conditions, which have hurt our exporters. Just yesterday, the dollar closed at over 75 cents American, which is the first time it hit that mark in 7 years. As the dollar climbs, our exports suffer, Mr. Speaker. Exporters have been facing a slower economy in the United States as well, although we hope that that will turn around. But the dollar itself is going to have a negative impact on our exports. The final outcome of the Bank of Montreal report in June of this year, and I really stress this was in June, which means there was a lot of information around even months ago. Their final outcome of the report was that they downgraded the growth rate that they were projecting for Nova Scotia to 2.1%. This is interesting as it shows that there were economic forecasts already signaling alarm in June of this year. The promise of a tax rebate was made and kept at about the same time, but at what cost? The writing was already on the wall economically, and this is just one report that would show that. The 10% tax reduction has to be on the table now as well. Make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, our province was already headed for trouble, and Hurricane Juan has simply added to the financial demands. The purpose of the resolution today is to ensure that the House will not be misled and Nova Scotians will not be misled into thinking that the cost of helping people recover from the hurricane is the main reason that the government is going to come in short of funds. We want to be perfectly clear about that. Hurricane Juan created a swath of damage across the province, and here in HRM, we can see the very direct results of that, particularly in the central part of Halifax, but also very much in Halifax-Clayton Park, which is the area I represent. The Halifax Regional Municipality has announced just recently that they will have to spend millions to clean up and restore the city to the state that it was in prior to Hurricane Juan. The damage and associated costs are very real, and they are dramatic, as all of us know. In the newspaper today, the HRM says that it will be looking for disaster relief from the federal and the provincial governments. That is what the people of Nova Scotia expect, that in times of crisis, provincial government will step in and provide relief. The fishing communities along our coasts, in villages like Prospect, Sambro, and Chesapeake, have been hit hard, and many people have lost their livelihood when lobster traps, fishing sheds, wharves, and even the fishing boats themselves were badly damaged and lost completely. These people need help to restore their lives and return to their own livelihoods. People on fixed and low incomes are also asking for help to repair their damaged homes and replace their lost food. Very little has been announced so far that's going to help those people in need. We recognize the need. It's time for the government to find out how we're going to respond to it. And all of us have constituents and people that are known to us who are in need, and the government needs to pony up and help them. That is not the purpose of this resolution to in any way signal that we should not help those people and do the right thing. What we want to make sure is that the government is doing the right thing now in making decisions that will not adversely impact many other people as the year unfolds. As has been mentioned here today, we're 7 months into this fiscal year. There's not a lot of time left to make changes, but there is time to cancel the tax cut, and that doesn't require a legislative change. If Ottawa is notified by October 15th, just notified by the government, then that's all that's required. We don't need to bring through legislation that would make that change. What we want, do we want to talk about balance bill? Okay, the government has to be held account for the decision that has passed to spend the $72 million on tax rebates and the decision that is coming to continue to give Nova Scotians a 10% tax cut. As was said by my colleague, the Liberal caucus has always been in favor of tax cuts when they can be afforded. There is some evidence that they can help an economy and help individuals and buoy confidence in the economy. But I don't believe that this year, with the kind of impacts that we see in the financial books right now, before they've even come in, as was mentioned, we have yet to see really the outcome of the previous fiscal year. We're months and months past the end of the 02-03 year. We don't know when we'll see those results. It'll be interesting to see if that balance or budget was actually balanced when the final figures come in. So right now we're left with a budget for this year that has left no room for bad news. No room for changes in the economy that could adversely affect Nova Scotians. So an emergency like Hurricane Juan has simply helped to point out the fact that the government hasn't allowed that room for responding to difficulties. The tax rebate scheme was clearly short-sighted, and it is leading to increased shortfalls in funds. These funds are needed for important services to Nova Scotians, for providing quality education, for providing good, reliable health care, home care to people who need it, community services to the people who are most vulnerable in our society. Nova Scotians, seniors, students, fishermen, workers, they will all suffer from the cuts that are needed to programs and services if the government continues on the tack of seeking the cuts rather than rescinding the tax cut they proposed. Cuts to programs and services are going to hurt people and the delivery of services. We're already a province that has the lowest and often the most meager services offered to our public. Ask anybody who's moved here from other provinces. You'll certainly find that people who are in the recruitment business have found they try to attract people to Nova Scotia, and some won't come because they don't like the state of our education system or the state of the schools. That's a known fact. It certainly is here in HRM. Perhaps some of you should visit, pay some attention. The financial problems were clear before the storm hit, and the storm has made them even more acute. We are very much concerned that that be very clear, and I appreciate your time, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. To continue the debate, recognize the honourable member for Colchester Musquodoboit Valley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to see you in the chair, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will be sharing some of my time with the honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's. First of all, I'd like to say, believe you me, Mr. Speaker, if I thought for one moment that the Liberals brought this resolution forward, as the NDP have suggested, to make political hay on the backs of those that have been impacted and plundered by Hurricane Juan, I would spend a great deal of this valued time criticizing, chastising, and scolding the Liberals. But I'm going to take this resolution, Mr. Speaker, at face value and give the Liberal caucus the benefit of the doubt. Most all of my constituents in Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley, and Mr. Speaker, that represents a good portion of Halifax Region municipality, especially Eastern Halifax County and Colchester County, have been, and I might add, including my family and I, were greatly impacted and had to endure and bear the devastation and ruin of Hurricane Juan. Fortunately, in terms of life and limb, the good folks in Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley were spared in that context. But we certainly weren't spared as far as homes, barns, trees, other buildings, woodlots, highways, and things of that nature, Mr. Speaker. We were hit extremely hard. And it seems today that, yes, everything comes with a price tag. And let's make no mistake about it. We must commend the paramedics, the police, the firefighters, the healthcare workers, the community service workers, EMO in Dartmouth, and the Premier and our minister responsible for EMO, they met every day last week as a consequence of Hurricane Juan. And I'm proud to say that the government employees and this government, and no doubt members of the opposition, recognize and acknowledge the hard work that the volunteers and the government employees put into the results of Hurricane Juan. Mr. Speaker, in Elderbank, close to the Middle Musquodoboit line in beautiful Colchester Musquodoboit Valley, Mr. John Dillman, a lifelong farmer, and his family sustained great damage. Their farm, their building, they could just sit in their kitchen and look out the window and see the devastation and ruin. Just a pile of rubble. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Dillman and his family milked some 35 to 40 cattle to keep within their quota and certainly work within the provisions of the supply management system that we value in the agriculture community. But for Mr. Dillman, his life and the life of his family have been turned upside down, Mr. Speaker. And do you think that the implications of Hurricane Juan haven't impacted the Dillman family? Yes, of course. There's financial cost to Hurricane Juan. Just look at the power lines. Just this afternoon, I had a call from the good folks on Route 227, Carroll's Corner Settlement. Some families are still without power. They're still without power. Yes, there's economic costs. There's also social costs associated with Hurricane Juan. So let's not forget that we are talking about a hurricane that rained hell and devastation and ruin on many, many parts of this great province we call Nova Scotia, and we're so proud to live in. So if we hear bafflegab and claptrap from members about whether or not the Liberals are sincere about this resolution, then I think what we have to do is just dismiss that, and let's not lose sight of the fact that there are costs. There's many, many costs associated and connected with Hurricane Juan. They're not all financial, but they darn well impact Nova Scotians. And I'm very, very proud. Again, we can't emphasize enough how Nova Scotians stood behind their values. Neighbors, brothers and sisters, fathers and mothers, uncles and aunts, grandparents stood behind each other. They started to rebuild as a consequence of Hurricane Juan. Mr. Speaker, just outside in Fort Ellis, Havy Whidden and his family, a farmer, a man that has put his life, his soul, into farming, saw the very thing that he worked so hard for just disintegrate as a consequence of Hurricane Juan. This big silo that usually stored his moisture grain came tumbling down, overthrew his milk house, and Mr. Speaker, there's probably some $180,000 worth of milking infrastructure, or you could call it the leasehold, inside that barn that has been ruined, and as well a valued dairy cow was killed. Just back the road in Shubenacadie, the Irving family, John and Jesse and Margaret, saw their building and perhaps their world come tumbling down. For that poor family, that was their life, that was their livelihood. Yes, there are financial consequences of Hurricane Juan, Mr. Speaker. There are also social costs. That barn is just a pile of rubble with a few square bales sticking out. That's all that's left. And a little brick milk house. A little brick milk house with a bulk tank in it. That's all that's left. That's all that's left, Mr. Speaker, of the Irving family's world. And they live down the road in a house, and they're wondering, how can they rebuild? How can they rebuild? Mr. Moxon up in Fort Ellis, his property, Mr. Moxon and his family sustained somewhere around $300,000 worth of damage, Mr. Speaker. And it disturbs me greatly to drive through the constituency, to speak to people, and learn that they have had to endure and bear such great devastation, be it financial, be it social, be whatever it is, but it impacted their life most of all, Mr. Speaker. So, you know, yes, there's implications. There's got to be implications. Does the Liberal caucus think that because of Hurricane Juan that there won't be costs connected to it? They can't be so naive. It's just like Harbor Solutions. Now, just to digress a little bit, Mr. Speaker, as I meant to say, although the member opposite that sponsors this resolution is on record as not supporting Harbor Solutions, this government provided $30 million to Harbor Solutions. We stood behind our word. We put $30 million into Harbor Solutions. And a further $2 million into land to accommodate the Harbor Solutions project. So we know as a government how to be responsible, and we have financial commitments we're going to make, we're going to keep, and we're going to stay within the balanced budget, Mr. Speaker. It's very, very important, but from one end of Colchester-Musquodoboit to the other, the riding has been impacted, whether it's the Halifax County Exhibition Grounds or whether it's poor Mr. and Mrs. McDonald in Cooks Brook. They've seen their world literally turned upside down. Will there be cost implications? Of course there will be. Now, as Mr. Speaker, as I indicated earlier, I would like to share some of my time with the honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
I want to give thanks to the member from Middle of Musquodoboit for giving me this opportunity, because indeed we've all seen a very busy couple of last 2 weeks. On September the 28th, of course, Mother Nature showed us her power. Hurricane Juan was the worst storm to hit Nova Scotia in living memory, although the loss of 2 Nova Scotians at the hands of the hurricane is tragic. We were very fortunate the loss of life was so limited. Juan's wrath ripped trees from the ground, roofs from homes and schools, and left thousands of Nova Scotians in the dark. many without electricity, water, telephone service. And there were indeed parts of Chester St. Margaret's that were indeed devastated by the storm. Mr. Speaker, I don't need to tell anybody in this House, one of the most pronounced characteristics of Nova Scotians is a generosity of spirit that has long sustained through the bad times and allowed us to revel together when times are good. Nova Scotians have a reputation for working together to overcome adversity, and I think we are all very encouraged to see that community spirit is alive and well in Chester St. Margaret's and many other parts of Nova Scotia. In days immediately after the storm, we saw the community spirit manifest itself in an impromptu neighborhood barbecues and the generous sharing of items such as generators or chainsaws or offers even of a hot shower. I could go on, but I think we're all aware of that. We also owe a debt of gratitude to the hundreds of members of the armed services who did exhausting and back-breaking work of clearing roads and streets so that the utility workers could restore phones and electric service. The mere presence of these young men and women on our streets brought us, to many people, a feeling of calm and reassurance, feelings that were much needed and much appreciated after Sunday's nerve-shattering storm. There were hundreds of telephone people and technicians, etc., from New Brunswick and Maine as well to help us out in our hour of need. Now, of course, we look to the federal government, the federal cousins of our third party, I don't have to remind everyone, to show that the same kind of compassion, and in fact, Mr. Speaker, the same kind of compassion they have given to other regions of our country during other crises. Our Premier has said, of course, that the damage to Nova Scotia is in the tens of millions of dollars. It would not even be beyond comprehension right now that it might be well over $100 million. Of course, unfortunately, our present Prime Minister has been too busy to visit Nova Scotia, and of course, Mr. No, he has not. Paul Jean Chrétien. Okay, my. But he has not come here. But of course, he's not here. But basically, of course, I think most Nova Scotians appreciate that we don't need FaceTime with the present Prime Minister. What we do need is relief from assistance that is both swift and sufficient. Of course, I know indeed many cabinet ministers, many federal MPs have visited Nova Scotia. And they've come up, I think, with this very same idea. They've seen that the extraordinary circumstances brought by the Hurricane Juan deserve a specific assessment when the federal government and with a specific remedy. In short, Mr. Speaker, now is the time for the federal government to work with the province, the municipalities affected by Hurricane Juan, and with individual Nova Scotians to ensure the damage done by the storm does not leave a lasting scar on our province. There are hundreds of examples of how Nova Scotians have risen to the many challenges presented by Hurricane Juan. We are now asking the federal government to match that effort and rise to the challenges presented by the insufficient disaster relief program in its present state. But we are going to, I really do believe, change. I understand I have about a minute and a half. And I basically, when one has the honor of representing a riding and visiting that riding, and I have visited the riding, and I'm good enough that the Premier has come out to Mariston, and we have visited, I don't know, I can't count them all. I could go through every community, Eastover, Westover, Peggy's Cove, Indian Harbor, Hubbards, Aspatagan, whatever. I mean, it goes on and on. But I do find that we are going to sit down, I have assurance that we're going to sit down after it's over What did we do right? And we'll certainly have a good consensus on that. And second is, can we improve? And indeed, there will be things. Because the great strength of Nova Scotians to handle adversity and like this is people working together and working well together, and practice makes perfect, and we do have that practice, especially in Cheshire St. Margaret's. Swiss Air example, I don't have to go into that. But we're working together, and I'm very, very proud. Guess what? We had 1 week, and we went to one. A lot of work was done in the last week, all sorts of work, and as good voluntary work, often voluntary work and professional work. We're going on the right track, and basically we certainly have to thank everybody that's done that. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Continuing debate on Resolution 173 with the honourable member from Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think there's an important lesson to be learned here from the fact that what the Liberals want to talk about and what the Conservatives have talked about is so very different. I think the members on that side of the House have done the right thing by talking about the hurricane and the devastation it's wrought on their constituencies, as it did on mine. Although naturally mine being an urban constituency, the nature and extent of the damage and impact is different than it is on more rural ridings. But that's because the Liberal Party, for their own reasons, have attempted to draw a link between the tax rebate, the $155 tax rebate, and Hurricane Juan. Now, it's unfortunate that in the wake of a natural disaster of this scope, that the Liberals would choose to bring forward two resolutions that attempt to link their fiscal position with this natural disaster. But I don't blame the members on that side of the House for ignoring the fiscal side of the resolution and instead addressing the human side of the hurricane. Mr. Speaker, in my own constituency, there was a great deal of damage. I myself saw a number of examples of very large trees fallen directly onto houses. I drove around in the wake of the storm and was amazed at the number of streets that were just blocked, impassable because of the damage, the number of wires that were down. Of course, power was out to most, not all of my constituency, but to most of my constituency for an extended period. There was flooding. Mr. Speaker, I'm sorry to say that my own constituency office was completely wrecked by the storm. My constituency office is in a shopping center. The roof of the shopping center was peeled back by the storm, and the entire office area of the mall was thoroughly flooded and soaked. And so not only my office, but many other offices have had to leave those premises for several months. But compared to the damage and devastation that I saw with my own eyes or that we saw on television every night, it seems a very small thing to lose the use of an office and to lose some papers and computers and furniture to the wrath of the storm. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to turn back to this issue of the tax rebate, which really is what the Liberals wanted to get at, although if I were to give some advice to the Liberals, it would be that if they want to talk about the tax rebate, maybe they can bring forward a resolution that's about the tax rebate and doesn't try and link it with some other completely unrelated issue like the natural disaster that Hurricane Juan was. I think everybody knows that everybody on this side of the House was opposed to the tax rebate. It was misconceived from the beginning. Mr. Speaker, the member for Cape Breton West says we voted for it, and of course we didn't. Of course we didn't. I spoke at length on numerous occasions, vehemently, vociferously against the tax rebate, and the Liberals joined us in that, Mr. Speaker. I think everybody knows, Mr. Speaker, that we voted against it because it was just wrong-headed from the beginning. After 4 years, Mr. Speaker, of having imposed hundreds of millions of dollars in new taxes and user fees on the Nova Scotia public, the government decided that after that punishment to the tune of hundreds of millions of dollars, that when it came time for the reward, that they were going to deliver it through the income tax system, which is progressive, because they had studiously avoided directly raising, and anyway, they did it indirectly, but that's another story, They had studiously avoided directly raising income tax rates over the course of their term, but they'd raised every other tax they could get their hands on, created new taxes, raised every user fee they could think of, and created many new user fees, all of which are regressive, so that if somebody doesn't have much money, a license fee has a much greater impact than somebody who's earning a great deal of money if they have to pay exactly the same amount. But as I said, when it came time for the reward, the Conservatives chose the income tax system to deliver that reward. Now, if you're going to raise regressive taxes and user fees, when it comes time to a reward, what you should be doing, as we said on numerous occasions, is lowering those things that you've raised or eliminating those things you've created. But instead, the Conservatives left all those regressive taxes and user fees in place and delivered the reward, the pre-election reward, in a different way. But what that meant was that for the 300,000 Nova Scotians of working age who don't earn enough money to pay income tax, they got nothing. Now, Mr. Speaker, I spoke to one lady on one street early in the election who really, really wanted to meet the Premier. She really, really wanted to give the Premier a piece of her mind about the tax rebate scheme, because she knew that she'd paid all these new taxes and user fees, but because she was on a disability pension, she knew that she wasn't going to get the $155, and neither was her husband, who was also on a disability pension. So they felt the pain, but those two people were among the 300,000 who got nothing from this government. Nothing. 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 And they said that they really, really, really hoped the Premier would knock on their door during the election, but unfortunately he didn't, because they had a thing or two they wanted to say to him. So, not to mention just the pure partisan cynicism of sending out over 400,000 checks within a couple of weeks of an election, Mr. Speaker. And it seems to me, it's difficult to know, but it seems to me that that explains, at least in part, the reduction in the vote obtained by the Conservative Party, because of the cynicism it engendered in the public about a government so crass as to send out checks within 2 weeks of an election, hoping that people would say, you know, with gratitude, well, thank you very much, I think I'll vote for you now. And of course, it was evident to everybody that that was not going to happen. So certainly our caucus can support the resolution to the extent that it condemns the tax rebate scheme, which was wrong, wrong, wrong from the very beginning, Mr. Speaker. But I'm still uncomfortable, I'll say personally I'm very uncomfortable that the Liberals in this resolution have drawn a link between the tax rebate and Hurricane Juan, which is why, even though this resolution won't come for a vote, it'd be difficult to support the resolution in its present form. Mr. Speaker, I do now want to turn to the question of Hurricane Juan, and I do want to address, through you, Mr. Speaker, the Finance Minister. Mr. Speaker, the damage caused by Hurricane Juan has not yet been fully assessed. Every person, every business, every community affected by the storm is acutely aware of the damage in their midst, but yet it will be a long time before an accurate financial value is placed on the damage. The government needs to make it a priority, a policy priority, to get people back to where they need to be. Individuals, families, businesses, communities, they need assistance from their governments plural, Mr. Speaker, to help them recover from the devastating losses. It is not yet clear what the financial damage is. It is not yet clear what the shares of the insurance industry and 3 levels of government will be, Mr. Speaker. That is something that will be clear in time, but it is not clear yet. And that is why it would be a mistake to say, as I believe the Minister of Finance was quoted as saying, it may have been misquoted, I don't know, that no matter what outlay the provincial government would make as a result of the hurricane, that the budget would be balanced no matter what. And that before anybody knows what that outlay is going to be. The minister would put the balanced budget ahead of the human toll of the hurricane. Now, it is possible that that the government will be able to do its duty and still maintain a balanced budget, or it may not. But it is hard to believe, Mr. Speaker, hard to believe that anyone in this House, in any party, would condemn the government for running a deficit if that deficit in this fiscal year were the direct result of the government assisting Nova Scotians to recover from this devastating natural disaster. If that is the cause, then we forgive the government for running a deficit, because it is more important to put people first. It is more important to put people and their families and their businesses and their communities first. But that is not a blank check for the government to do whatever it pleases, to run whatever deficit it may want to do, to spend whatever it wants on any other project or thing, to waste any money anywhere in its operations. This is not a blanket blessing of a deficit, period. What I'm saying is it would be difficult for anyone in this House, certainly difficult for this caucus, to condemn the government for running a deficit that is the direct result of spending necessitated to help Nova Scotians recover from the hurricane. The government must still be vigilant on every other program and service. It must police waste and root it out mercilessly wherever it can find it. It must be vigilant at every turn with the public's money, because it is the public's money. It must start doing things like going after HST fraud. It must seek out those sources of revenue that rightfully belong to the government today, but which I believe, and the opposition leader believes, as he stated in question period today, which our caucus believes are not being fully pursued. Mr. Speaker, we need that revenue, and if we are not getting revenue, to which we'll lawfully do, then we need to do what it takes to go and get it. We need to stop wasting money on things like firing the CEO of the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation and giving him $90,000 to walk away, after headhunting that same CEO a year ago cost $100,000 or more. That is a waste, a direct and complete waste of money. That kind of thing must not be allowed to happen. And we will continue to be vigilant in watching over the government to make sure that that does not happen. But make no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker, this government's priority must be, and we support the priority, of helping this province and its people and its businesses recover from Hurricane Juan. So, Mr. Speaker, in summary on this resolution today, we condemn the $155 rebate today, as we did from the day the budget was released, from the day that Nova Scotia first became aware that this is what the government was proposing. Every single day after Budget Day, we condemned it soundly and roundly, and we voted against it. And the Liberals, I think the Liberals just need to go and review Hansard, Mr. Speaker, because, of course, the Liberals don't stop at saying things that are not true. And I have to say, Mr. Speaker, if I may, as the chair of the Public Accounts Committee, who's trying to forge a consensus, that I'm quite taken aback that a member of that committee, after its first meeting, would stand up in this House and give a version of what happened this morning that was simply not true. I don't know why he's doing it, but he does. So the Liberals are not past standing up and saying things that are not true. But we know that the NDP spoke loudly and strongly against the tax rebate from day one. It was the wrong thing to do. It was the wrong thing then. It's the wrong thing now. But that does not mean that we should link that tax rebate with the devastation of Hurricane Juan, nor should it cause us to say to the government anything other than what we all have to agree is true, which is that recovery from the hurricane must be the government's top priority. And after that, Mr. Speaker, we will talk about the financial consequences. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
A recognize the honourable member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to speak in favor of this particular resolution. Unfortunately, unlike the previous speaker who likes to feel he has a patent on intelligence over all others on political, social, and economic matters for the province, I guess you'll just have to bear with my limited experience and knowledge. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker indicated that the NDP were solidly against the $155 rebate. Well, it's unfortunate that he didn't speak to the leader of his party, who went around during the election saying, I would never take that back. I'm in favor, you've got it, keep it. Okay? So, on one hand, they're saying, you keep it, we're glad you got it. But on the other hand, they're coming in the House here and saying, no, we're totally opposed to it. Again, trying to be on both sides of the issue at the same time. Typical Socialist Party. Mr. Speaker, we're speaking to the issue of financial credibility. The previous Minister of Finance stood in this House in a debate with me on an opposition date, on a previous day, and he admitted in our exchange that the government had borrowed $118 million over and above their balanced budget. So how can you have a balanced budget if you're spending $118 million more than you're taking in taxes, transfers, or whatever? So there's no balanced budget even before we start talking about the shortfall from the transfer payments or from the $32 million that was referenced by the Minister of Finance, or Hurricane Juan, or anything else. So let's put that on the table. The NDP, Socialist Party, talk about financial accountability and being prudent managers. They introduced a bill in this House, which they refused to call for debate, asking the taxpayers of Nova Scotia to pay for the cost of setting up public auto insurance, but they refused to tell us how much it's going to cost. The leader of the NDP said it was going to be $2 million. And then when we asked for the financial data on that, they said, go west, go find it yourself. Now, what kind of leadership is that? That any party would try and hold itself out as wanting to be in government, and then they tell those that they should be held accountable to, go west if you want the information. Go west, boy. Well, well, well. What kind of leadership is that? The fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, they have no idea. They have no idea how much that's going to cost and what impact that would have on the bottom line. We're talking about credibility on financial, fiscal management. So if it's only $2 million, by golly, it shouldn't be that complex to provide the rationale for it. If you take 1,200 employees, or 300, or whatever number they want to inject into that process, just the rental fees for office space and heat and lice and leaseholds and so on, that would be more than $2 million. Well, Mr. Speaker, take the square footage, multiply by the cost of the square footage, and look at fair market value, and the honourable member may, just may, have an answer. But since they don't think like that, we wouldn't expect them to provide the detail. Mr. Speaker, I would submit that there has to be at least one, at least their finance critic. He holds himself out as being, well, I don't know. It's almost indescribable how he sees himself, the guru of political intelligence on finance of this province. They couldn't balance the budget on a fudge sale, for heaven's sake, because they won't even make that little bit of information available to the people of Nova Scotia. So how can that be a credible alternative to any government, whether it be Liberal, Tory, or what have you? I mean, and this is what we're talking about, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, if the honourable member for Hants East wants to go that direction, let's not argue with an unarmed man. Let's leave it that way. Mr. Speaker, the $155 check during the last election, people took it. Why wouldn't they take it? Because the reason that I received as I went door to door was, if the government is that bad at managing money, it's better we get some of it, and we can do something with it anyway, because they can't look after our finances, so we'll do it ourselves. Give us our tax money back and we'll do something. But, Mr. Speaker, time after time after time, do you know what they said on the big picture? They would have been better off taking that money, that $68 million or 72 or whatever figure you want to use, and put it into roads. Fix the roads of this province so that people can drive on a half-decent road. Mr. Speaker, I had a call from a constituent this morning that's facing a $1,600 bill, damage to his vehicle, because of the deplorable state of the roads in the community that he lives in. And the Department of Transportation and Public Works is saying, that's not our fault. You should have been able to see that massive hole in front of you and avoid it, even though it takes up 2/3 of the asphalt that he would be driving over. I mean, this is not, we're not in, these stock car races where you got to kind of maneuver your way around. Mr. Speaker, if the government had allocated that money in a responsible fashion, whether it be on the roads, do you know, Mr. Speaker, at $100,000 a kilometer, they could have paved over 680 kilometers of secondary roads in this province. 680 kilometers. Can you imagine the savings to people's vehicles? It doesn't matter whether it be all in Tory ridings or NDP ridings or Liberal ridings. Every mile that's done or every kilometer that's done, that's one less you worry about. And that's one less incident where people are paying through the teeth exorbitant fees, such as my constituent had to do in this one case, and then to be left high and dry by the government. Think of the impact on insurance rates in this province. That impacts on the bottom line. What about health care? If they didn't want to put it in roads, they could put it in health care. You know, the DHAs, they're coming up short. They always do because of the demands for health care. Well, what's the government doing? Nothing. Nothing. Let's look at this famous RIM program that the government brought in 2 years ago. There was $8 million allotted for that. The Tory members are saying it's a good program. Well, Mr. Speaker, let's go there. Let's go there. The whole purpose was to assist rural Nova Scotia, improve the infrastructure as best they could, and help the local contractors who were shut out because the big contractors, like Dexter's and Dillman's and so on, were getting the lion's share of all the major contracts, and these small contractors were being shut out. And the members in the Tory backbenches, they know this. And what happens? The government starts putting it out to tender, and we got contractors coming in from New Brunswick, like Miller's, bringing in their own workers. What was the benefit there? What was the benefit there to the local contractors? What was the benefit there to the local economy, Mr. Speaker? And they stomp on their chest and say, what a great job. Do you know what's even more disturbing, Mr. Speaker? Talk about on the bottom line. They're now tapping in, I'm told, into the operating budget that the OSs have. The operating supervisors at the local level are now tapping into their regular budget to compensate for overspending in the RIM program. Maybe that's why the government's cropping it up to $20 million this year. But they don't say that. That's part of their privatization plan. That's why they have 50 less tractors on their fleet this year than they did 2 years ago when they started this program. It's all part of the cynical Tory plan to privatize. You know, they're compromising service, the quality of service. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Transportation and Public Works says, big spender. Well, you have to spend a little to save people's lives and to give them safe roads to drive on, which is being compromised. It defeats the purpose of what the whole thing was set up for. Well, Mr. Speaker, if that minister hadn't been in a government that bankrupted this province, maybe we wouldn't have to make those decisions back between 93 and 98. And he knows, the public record will show that when the creditors got a hold of the books in 1993, they said the province was on the verge of bankruptcy. And now we got them back at the trough again. We got him back at the trough again. Is it any wonder? Is it any wonder we're concerned about a balanced budget? Mr. Speaker, thank heavens the Minister of Transportation is not the Minister of Finance. We'd really be in trouble. We'd really be in trouble. At least there are a few checks and balances in there. I do have some confidence in this minister that at least at the end of the day, he'll owe up to the fact that there will not be a balanced budget at the end of the fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, I realize my time has pretty well come to a close. There are so many issues that we could cover on this here. Here's the newspaper clipping, Mr. Speaker. I'll table it. And it's headed, NDP Want Contest Cut, referring to the $155. So much for consistency.
Thank you. The honourable member's time has expired on the debate. I thank all the members for taking part in the debate. The honourable government House Leader on tomorrow's hours and order of business.
Mr. Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again tomorrow at the hour of 12 noon. The House will sit from 12 until 8 p.m. 12 until 8 p.m. The order of business following the daily routine will be public bills for second reading. And, Mr. Speaker, we'll start off with Bill number 2, and when we complete, or if we complete Bill 2, we'll carry on down the order papers 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 15, etc. Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move the House now rise.
Until 12 noon tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Contrary minded.